The truth is, most people misunderstand this. We are conditioned by centuries of romantic literature and adventure novels to believe that destiny is a destination. A physical place located far across the ocean, hidden in the mist of a foreign mountain range, or buried beneath the sands of a distant desert. We are taught that to find our fortune, we must leave our homes, abandon our comforts, and embark on a perilous odyssey. But the sensational, earth-shattering reality revealed in Russell Conwell's Acres of Diamonds is that this belief is not just a harmless myth, it is a psychological disease that has led millions of men and women to ruin. The narrative begins not in a boardroom or a stock exchange, but on the banks of the ancient river Indus, in a time when camels were the chariots of the wealthy and stories were the currency of the wise. The scene is set with a level of atmospheric intensity that rivals a cinematic epic. An old Persian guide, a man of deep wrinkles and deeper wisdom, sits by a crackling fire with a traveler, recounting a legend that is as old as the stones beneath their feet. This is not merely a story, it is a warning. It is the tale of Al-Havd, a man who possessed everything the human heart should desire, yet died with nothing but the salt of the ocean in his lungs. A victim of the most dangerous illusion in the human experience, the belief that over there is better than right here. Al-Havd was a man of substance. The narrative paints him as the archetype of the contented patriarch. He owned a vast farm, lush with orchards of dates and figs, fields of waving grain, and gardens that smelled of jasmine and rose. He had money out at interest, a loving wife, and children who looked up to him with respect. By every metric of the ancient world, Al-Havd was a success. He was wealthy because he was contented, and he was contented because he was wealthy. His life was a closed loop of satisfaction. But the human soul is a fragile vessel, susceptible to the slightest crack. One evening, an ancient Buddhist priest visited Al-Havd's home. The priest sat by the fire, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames, and began to speak of the creation of the world. He told of how the Almighty spun the fog to make the granite, how he forged the copper and the silver, and how, in a final act of divine artistry, he created the diamond. The priest's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, vibrating with a sensational intensity that captivated the simple farmer. A diamond, the priest declared, is a congealed drop of sunlight. He spoke of its power, its unyielding hardness, and its infinite value. If you had a diamond the size of your thumb, the priest said, gesturing to the fire, you could purchase the county. And if you had a mine of diamonds, you could place your children upon thrones through the influence of their great wealth. The effect of these words on Al-Havd was catastrophic. It was a psychological amputation. In a single moment, the value of his orchards, his grain, and his gardens evaporated. He went to his bed that night a poor man. He had not lost an acre of land, he had not lost a single sheep, he had not lost a coin from his purse. But he was poor because he was discontented. And he was discontented because he feared he was poor. The demon of comparison had entered his heart. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, no longer seeing the beauty of his life, but only the phantom sparkle of diamonds he did not possess. The narrative analyzes this shift as the origin of poverty. Poverty, in this context, is not a lack of resources, it is a lack of appreciation. Al-Havd had succumbed to the belief that his current reality was insufficient, simply because a theoretical reality existed that was better. Sleep evaded him. The next morning, he sought out the priest with a frantic, feverish urgency. Will you tell me where I can find diamonds? He demanded. The priest, surprised by the transformation in the man's demeanor, from a calm host to a desperate hunter, replied, Diamonds? What do you want with diamonds? Al-Havd's eyes burned. I want to be immensely rich. He said, I want to place my children on thrones. The priest, seeing the man's resolve, pointed vaguely to the world beyond. If you will find a river that runs at high noon over white sands, between high mountains, in those white sands you will always find diamonds. The directions were vague, mythical, almost impossible, but Al-Havd did not hear the impossibility, he heard only the promise. The narrative describes the tragic dismantling of a life. Al-Havd sold his farm for a fraction of its value. He collected his money, left his family in the care of a neighbor, and set off into the world, a wanderer in search of a dream. He began his search at the mountains of the moon. He traversed the rugged terrain of Palestine. He wandered through the great cities and wild forests of Europe. Years passed. The narrative accelerates, showing the erosion of the man. His clothes turned to rags. His youth withered into age. His wealth, once substantial enough to buy counties, dwindled to nothing. The diamonds remained elusive, a mirage that retreated with every step he took. Finally, the story brings us to the shores of Barcelona, Spain. A great tidal wave came rolling in through the Pillars of Hercules. Al-Havd, broken, destitute, and crushed by the weight of his own failure, looked at the oncoming water. He had chased a fantasy across the known world and found only despair. In a final act of tragic surrender, unable to face the shame of his return or the emptiness of his future, he cast himself into the foaming waves and was lost forever. He died a pauper in a strange land, a victim of his own blindness. But the narrative does not end in the waters of Spain. With a cinematic cut, the story snaps back to the banks of the Indus River, to the very farm Al-Havd had sold in his madness. The man who had purchased the farm was a simple soul, content to work the land that Al-Havd had abandoned. He did not dream of thrones, he dreamed of healthy camels and good crops. One day, he led his camel into the garden to drink from the shallow brook that meandered through the property. As the camel drank, stirring up the silt with its nose, the man noticed a curious flash of light from the white sands of the streambed. It was a black stone, unremarkable in shape, but containing a strange eye of light that reflected all the hues of the rainbow. He picked it up, marveling at its weight and its curious beauty, and carried it into the house. He placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, a simple decoration, and returned to his work, ignorant of what he had found. Days later, the same Buddhist priest returned to the farm, perhaps to pay his respects to Al-Hafid's successor. He entered the room and stopped dead in his tracks. The flash of light from the mantelpiece struck him with the force of a revelation. He rushed to the stone, his hands trembling. "Here is a diamond," he cried out. "Has Al-Havd returned?" The new owner shook his head, puzzled. No, Al-Havd has not returned. And that is not a diamond. That is nothing but a stone we found right out here in our own garden. The priest, trembling with excitement, seized the stone. "I tell you I know a diamond when I see it," he proclaimed, his voice rising to a shout. "I know its history, its physics, its soul. This is a diamond." Together, they rushed out to the garden. They stirred the white sands with their fingers, and lo, there were more stones, more beautiful and more valuable than the first. The narrative reveals a sensational truth that echoes through the corridors of history. This was the discovery of the Golconda diamond mines, the most magnificent diamond deposit the world has ever known. The Koh-i-Noor that sits in the crown of the Queen of England, the Orlov diamond in the Russian scepter, they all came from this single plot of land. The irony is cataclysmic. Al-Havd had owned acres of diamonds. He had walked over them every day. He had watered his crops with the stream that hid them. But he had sold them for a pittance to travel the world in search of the very thing he had left behind. He died a pauper in a strange land, while the man who stayed and worked the ground became the wealthiest man in the East. The analysis of this tragedy reveals the fundamental blindness of the human condition. We are wired to believe that opportunity is a function of geography. We think that, over there, in a different city, a different job, a different industry, lies the pot of gold. We look at the mountains in the distance and see them as purple and majestic. But the mountains we stand on seem composed only of rough rocks and dirt. The lesson is brutal. Diamonds do not look like diamonds in their rough state. To the uneducated eye, they look like common black stones. Al-Havd failed not because there were no diamonds, but because he did not know what a diamond looked like in the rough. He was looking for the cut and polished gem, the finished product, not the raw opportunity. The narrative transitions from the ancient legend to the gritty reality of the American frontier, proving that this blindness is not a Persian fable but a human universal. Conwell recounts the story of a man living in California in 1847. This man owned a ranch. He heard that gold had been discovered in Southern California, and the fever took him. He sold his ranch to Colonel Sutter and went off to hunt for gold. He spent the rest of his life wandering, never striking it rich. Meanwhile, Colonel Sutter, the man who bought the ranch, built a mill on a stream that ran through the property. One day, his little girl brought him some wet sand from the raceway. In that sand, they found the first flakes of gold that triggered the California gold rush. The man who had sold the ranch had been sitting on top of the richest gold mine in the continent. He sold it to go look for gold elsewhere. The sensational absurdity of it stuns the listener. The seller was literally sitting on the gold, but he was so busy looking at the horizon that he never looked down. The story intensifies with another example. Moving to the oil fields of Pennsylvania, a man owned a farm there and found the black, sticky substance in the creek to be a nuisance. It ruined the water for his cattle. He wrote to his cousin in Canada, complaining about the poor quality of his land. The cousin wrote back, suggesting he sell the farm and come to Canada to work in the oil industry, which was booming. The man caught the fever. He studied oil production. He learned the geology. He became an expert in theory. He sold his farm for $833, a paltry sum, and moved to Canada. The new owner of the farm, trying to water his cattle, found the creek dammed up by a plank the previous owner had placed there to stop the oil from flowing. He removed the plank, and a tidal wave of oil surged forth. This farm became the site of the first great oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. It produced millions of dollars in wealth. The man who sold it had studied oil. He knew the theory of oil, but he did not recognize the oil ruining his own creek. He was an expert in the abstract, but a fool in the concrete. The psychological flaw exposed here is the farsightedness of greed. When we are consumed by the desire for wealth, our vision extends to the horizon, blurring everything in our immediate vicinity. We undervalue what we have because we have it. Familiarity breeds contempt, and in business, familiarity breeds blindness. As the first part of this journey concludes, we are left standing in the shoes of Al Havd, looking at our own lives. We feel the sting of the missed opportunities, the black stones we have kicked aside in our haste to find fortune elsewhere. The narrative has established the disease of distance, the belief that wealth is geography. But the cure has yet to be fully explored. If the diamonds are here, right under our feet, why can't we see them? And more importantly, how do we train our eyes to recognize the rough form of opportunity before we sell our farm to a stranger? The story prepares to pivot from the tragedies of the past to the practical, often humorous, and deeply inspiring stories of those who did look down. We are about to meet the inventors, the merchants, and the everyday people who found millions in the most boring, mundane corners of their existence. The realization is dawning. The problem is not a lack of diamonds, the problem is a lack of vision. The narrative shifts now from the mountains of gold and the rivers of oil to the valleys of the ordinary, where the true acres of diamonds lie hidden in plain sight. We are overlooking the detail that diamonds, in the modern world, are not geological accidents, they are human needs waiting to be satisfied. Conwell argues that the most valuable assets are often the most boring, the most domestic, and the most overlooked. To illustrate this, the story transports us to a humble kitchen in Massachusetts. A man sat watching his wife prepare dinner. She was struggling to cut a loaf of fresh, warm bread. The knife was dull, the bread was soft, and the result was a crumbled mess of slices. Most men would have seen this as a minor annoyance, a triviality of domestic life not worth a second thought. But this man saw a diamond. He realized that if his wife struggled with this, millions of other women must be struggling too. He did not dream of a gold mine in Peru, he dreamed of a better way to slice bread. He went to his workshop and invented a simple mechanical bread cutter, a device so unglamorous it would make a venture capitalist yawn. Yet, he sold millions of them. He built a fortune not by conquering a continent, but by solving a crumbly problem on his own kitchen table. The lesson analyzes the law of observation. The man in Massachusetts succeeded because he was present. He was not mentally living in a future fantasy, he was deeply engaged with the friction of the now. Conwell reinforces this with the story of a man who made his fortune in the hat business. This man did not start with a factory or a brand. He started by sitting in church. While the minister preached, this man looked at the heads of the congregation. He observed a peculiar detail. Most men had a slight depression in the side of their heads. A hollow, that the standard round hats of the day did not fit comfortably. He realized that the hat industry was making hats for ideal heads, not real heads. He went home and designed a hat that accommodated this common anatomical quirk. He didn't advertise, he didn't need to. The hats fit so perfectly that men bought them by the thousands. The diamond was not in the felt or the ribbon, it was in the hollow of the cheek that everyone else had ignored. The sensation of this success is the triumph of the specific. While his competitors were fighting over price, he won on fit. The narrative intensity builds as Conwell addresses the aspiring merchant. We meet a young man in a small town who dreams of being a prince of commerce. Like the legendary John Wanamaker, he complains to his father that he has no capital, no rich uncle, and no opportunity in their sleepy village. He wants to move to New York, where the real action is. The father, a wise man who understands the acres of diamonds philosophy, stops him. You want to be a merchant? The father asks. Then tell me, what does our neighbor, the blacksmith, need? The son shrugs, annoyed. I don't know. I'm not a gossip. The father persists. What does the schoolteacher need? What does the shoemaker struggle with? The son throws up his hands. How should I know? I want to do business, not run a charity. The father then delivers the crushing truth that shatters the son's illusion. If you do not know what your neighbors need, you cannot be a merchant. He explains that commerce is nothing more than the satisfaction of human needs. The great merchants did not start with millions, they started with empathy. They saw that the farmers needed a stronger plow, or that the women needed a better thread. They filled that need, and the wealth followed naturally. The son's blindness to his neighbors was a blindness to his own fortune. He was looking for business in the abstract, spreadsheets, offices, titles, while stepping over the customers in the concrete. The analysis here reveals the economy of attention. Wealth flows to those who pay attention to others. The billionaire is often just a person who paid attention to a small problem that annoyed a billion people. The story then pivots to the moral conflict that plagues many seekers of wealth. Conwell, a Baptist minister himself, steps into the pulpit of the narrative to dismantle the poverty gospel. He recounts a sensational interaction with a young theological student who approached him. Trembling with self-righteousness, Mr. Conwell, the student asked, does not the Bible say that money is the root of all evil? Conwell, with the fire of a prophet, corrected him, no, young man, the Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. He launched into a defense of wealth that was radical for his time and remains controversial today. He argued that to be poor is not a virtue, it is often a result of negligence or a refusal to serve. He declared, you ought to be rich. You have no right to be poor. This statement hits the listener with the force of a thunderclap. How can a minister say such a thing? Conwell explains, money is power. It is a neutral force that amplifies the character of the holder. Money is the printed Bible. Money is the brick of the church. Money is the salary of the missionary. Money is the medicine for the sick. To reject money is to reject the power to do good. The man who says, I do not want money, is effectively saying, I do not want to help my fellow man. He tells the story of a man who invented a better way to make matches. Before his invention, match workers suffered from phossy jaw, a horrific disease caused by white phosphorus. The new invention made matches safer and cheaper. The inventor became a millionaire. Was he a villain? No, he was a savior. His wealth was the certificate of service given to him by a grateful society. The analysis here reveals the sanctification of commerce. When business is done honestly, when $1 of value is traded for $1 of cash, it is a holy act. It improves the world. The acres of diamonds are not just for personal luxury, they are the fuel for social progress. The narrative flow carries us to the myth of capital. The most common excuse for failure is, I have no money to start. Conwell shatters this with the story of a man named Mr. Ash. Mr. Ash had started with nothing, literally zero. He had walked into a store and asked for work. He saved every penny. He bought a simple jackknife for a few cents. He noticed that the handles of standard knives were clumsy for children to use. He traded up, improved the design slightly, and sold it for a profit. He bought a few buttons. He traded them. He slowly, painfully, built a snowball of capital. Conwell argues that capital is not money, capital is character. If you cannot manage 50 cents, you cannot manage $50,000. The sensational truth is that starting with inherited wealth is often a curse. He cites the statistics of the heirs. Out of 17 rich men's sons, often only one dies rich. Why? Because they never learned the art of the acorn. They started with the oak tree, and because they didn't grow it, they didn't know how to keep it from rotting. They spent their lives trying to spend the diamonds, not dig for them. The story intensifies as Conwell dissects the greatness of the ordinary. We live in a world that worships the great man, the president, the general, the celebrity. We think that to be great, we must leave our homes and ascend to a high office. Conwell destroys this illusion with the story of the Battle of the Wilderness. During the Civil War, a certain regiment was ordered to hold a position at all costs. The standard-bearer was shot down. The flag fell in the mud. The line began to waver. A simple private, a boy from a farm who had never held office, never sought glory, and whose name was unknown to the generals, leapt forward. He grabbed the flag, wiped the mud from it, and held it high amidst the hail of bullets. He rallied the troops. He saved the line. He was not a general, he was not a senator. He was a nobody, but in that moment, he was the greatest man in the army. Conwell argues that greatness is not a title, it is a quality of character that shines brightest in the darkest, most ordinary corners of life. The woman who raises her children with love and integrity in a small cottage is greater than the king who neglects his subjects in a palace. The man who keeps his word in a business deal of $5 is greater than the tycoon who cheats for $5 million. The acres of diamonds are often found in the soil of duty. By doing the small, boring, difficult thing that is right in front of you, whether it is raising a child, sweeping a floor, or balancing a ledger, you are mining the rarest diamonds of all, integrity and reliability. The narrative moves to the illusion of the far-off charitable cause. Conwell criticizes those who want to save the world, but ignore the starving family down the street. He tells of a church committee that raised thousands of dollars for foreign missions to convert the heathen, while the roof of their own sexton's house was leaking and his children were hungry. He argues that charity begins at home. This is not selfishness, it is strategic benevolence. You cannot lift the world if you are standing on quicksand. You must build a strong foundation of wealth and stability in your own community first, and then expand outward. The acres of diamonds philosophy demands that you bloom where you are planted before you try to seed the clouds. The analysis reveals the hypocrisy of distance. It is easy to love the abstract poor in a distant land, it is hard to love the difficult, smelly, annoying poor neighbor next door. But the diamond is always next door. As the second part concludes, the listener is stripped of their excuses. The lack of capital excuse is gone, Mr. Ash. The moral objection is gone, the gospel of wealth. The need for greatness excuse is gone, the battle of the wilderness. We are left with the uncomfortable realization that the only barrier between us and our acres of diamonds is our own willingness to serve. The diamonds are not hidden, they are just disguised as work. The story prepares to descend into the final integration, a set of powerful, concluding stories about the women who found diamonds in the most unlikely places, and the ultimate definition of what it means to be a success in a world obsessed with status. The air is thick with the promise that if we simply open our eyes, the ground beneath us will begin to sparkle. Today, more than ever, we are paralyzed by the magnitude of our own ambitions. We look at the titans of industry, the inventors of the internet, and the architects of skyscrapers, and we feel small. We believe that to be wealthy, we must do something big. We must disrupt an industry, colonize Mars, or cure a plague. But Russell Conwell, in the final and most intimate movement of his lecture, shatters this paralysis with the gospel of the tiny. He transports the listener from the grand battlefields and the high seas to a sewing room in a modest house in New England. He tells the story of a woman, a simple, hard-working wife, who was frustrated. Her husband's shirts were constantly losing buttons. It was a trivial annoyance. A micro problem that happened in millions of homes every day. Most people would have just sewn the buttons back on, complaining quietly. But this woman looked at the button not as a chore, but as a diamond in the rough. She asked a sensational question: why must we sew them? Why can they not snap? She didn't have a laboratory. She didn't have venture capital. She simply took a piece of wire and bent it. She experimented with the tension of the metal. She created the first snap button. It was a tiny, unglamorous piece of twisted metal. It didn't look like a diamond. But when she patented it, she unleashed a revolution in the clothing industry. Conwell reveals that this woman made more money from that tiny snap than many men made from gold mines. The lesson analyzes the physics of value. A small problem, multiplied by millions of people, equals a massive fortune. The acres of diamonds are often hidden in the friction of the mundane. The seeker learns to look for the things that snag, the things that break, the things that annoy. In every annoyance, there is a patent waiting to be written. The narrative intensity builds as Conwell returns to the theme of blindness, with a story that strikes close to home, literally. He tells of a man in Newburyport, Massachusetts, who sold his farm to go west and prospect for silver. He spent his life in the rugged mountains of Colorado and Nevada, breaking his back, swinging a pickaxe, and finding nothing but dust. He returned home an old, broken man, dying in poverty, but the twist is a dagger to the heart. This man, when he was a boy living on that very farm in Newburyport, used to sit on a large, heavy stone at the edge of a well. He sat on it to peel apples. He sat on it to read. He sat on it to dream of the silver he would one day find in the West. After he sold the farm, the new owner examined that stone. It was heavy. It was strange. He broke a piece off and had it tested. It was nearly pure silver. The farm itself was sitting on a vein of silver that became one of the most productive mines in the state. The man had literally spent his youth warming a seat on a fortune that he then traveled 3,000 miles to look for. The psychological depth of this tragedy is the externalization of hope. We project our hopes onto the horizon because looking at the ground beneath us requires a humility we often lack. We would rather be romantic failures in a distant land than practical successes in our own backyard. The story then pivots to the philosophy of greatness. Conwell challenges the listener's definition of a great man or great woman. We are trained to think of greatness as fame. Conwell argues that greatness is service. He tells the story of a man in a small town who was never elected mayor, never wrote a book, and never made a speech. But when a fire broke out, he was the first with a bucket. When a widow needed wood chopped, his axe was heard in the forest. When a child was lost, his lantern led the search. When this man died, the entire town wept. The businesses closed. The streets were lined with people. Conwell asks, was he not the greatest man in that town? He argues that wealth is a natural byproduct of this kind of automatic service. If you serve your community with that level of intensity, the community will naturally elevate you. You cannot stop the cream from rising, and you cannot stop the servant from becoming the master of his own fortune. The acres of diamonds are found in the hearts of your neighbors. If you win their hearts through service, their purses will open to you as a matter of course. The narrative flow then enters the sanctuary of the meta-story. This is the most emotional and powerful segment, linking the book to the real-world legacy of Russell Conwell himself. The listener might wonder, did Conwell practice what he preached? The answer is the story of the 57 cents. Conwell tells of a little girl named Hattie Mae Wyatt who stood outside his small, crowded church in Philadelphia, crying because there was no room for her to enter. Conwell lifted her onto his shoulders and carried her inside. He told her that one day, they would build a church big enough for everyone. Shortly after, the little girl fell ill and died. Under her pillow, they found a small purse with 57 cents in pennies and a scribbled note. This is to help build the bigger church. Conwell didn't look at the 57 cents as small change. He looked at it as an acre of diamonds. He took those pennies to the bank and exchanged them for 57 bright, new pennies. He told the story to his congregation and sold the pennies as bricks for the new church. The story spread like wildfire. It went viral before the internet existed. Money poured in. From those 57 cents, Conwell built the Great Baptist Temple. But he didn't stop there. He saw the diamonds in the uneducated young men and women of Philadelphia who couldn't afford college. He used the momentum of the church to start a night school. He taught them himself. That night school grew. It became Temple University, one of the largest universities in the United States. And he founded the Samaritan Hospital, now Temple University Hospital. The sensational realization hits the listener, this entire empire of education and healing, which has served millions of people for over a century, started with *** 57 cents. It started with a diamond that looked like pennies. If Conwell had waited for $1 million endowment, he would have waited forever. Instead, he dug where he stood. He took what he had, a tragedy and a handful of copper, and transmuted it into a legacy. This is the ultimate proof of the book's thesis. Greatness is not about the resources you have, it is about the resourcefulness you apply. The acres of diamonds are not physical assets, they are the potential energy stored in the smallest acts of faith and courage. The narrative momentum builds to the final charge. Conwell addresses the listener directly, stripping away the last vestiges of hesitation. He attacks the excuse of time. He tells of men who started at 40, 50, 60. He argues that age is irrelevant because opportunity is eternal. As long as there are human beings with problems, there are diamonds to be mined. He attacks the excuse of location. He points to the mud of the farm, the grease of the factory, the paper of the office. He demands that the listener look at their own hands. What can these hands do? He thunders. What can this mind conceive? He reframes the entire world as a garden of riches, disguised as a wilderness of work. The analysis of the final movement reveals the spirituality of commerce. Conwell bridges the gap between the material and the divine. He posits that God did not hide the diamonds to taunt us, he hid them to test us. He hid them in the rough to force us to learn the art of polishing. He hid them in the ground to force us to learn the dignity of digging. The acres of diamonds are a reward for the evolution of character. You do not get the diamond and then become a great person, you become a great person. And the diamond reveals itself to you. The wealth is the echo of your own growth. The climax leads to a state of radiant clarity. The listener stands at the end of the journey, no longer looking at the horizon with longing, but looking at the ground with reverence. The job they hate is no longer a prison, it is a mine. The difficult boss is no longer a tyrant, he is a customer. The small town is no longer a trap, it is a market. The giant within has awakened, armed with the pickaxe of observation and the shovel of service. The fear of missing out is replaced by the thrill of digging in. Analyze the ultimate meaning that the book intends to convey. Acres of Diamonds is a manifesto for imminent abundance. Russell Conwell's core message is that wealth is a state of awareness. The universe is saturated with opportunity, but it is invisible to the eye of greed and visible only to the eye of service. The book serves as a psychological compass, redirecting our focus from the there to the here, from the then to the now. It teaches that the only way to escape poverty is to embrace the richness of the immediate moment. The final lesson is one of universal possibility, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, no matter what you have. You are standing on holy ground. The diamonds are real. The only question is, are you willing to dig? The journey ends not with a map to a treasure, but with a mirror. You realize that you are the mine. Your mind, your energy, your love for your neighbor, these are the acres of diamonds. And the moment you start to serve, the ground beneath your feet turns to gold. He who can see the invisible can do the impossible. Dig in your own backyard. For you are standing on a fortune.